The morning my grandmother died, I was the one holding her hand. My aunt was at a spa in Scottsdale, my uncle was on a golf course in Naples, my cousin was doing whatever 28-year-olds with trust fund allowances do on a Tuesday in October. But I was there, in that white hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and artificial flowers, watching the monitor flatten and listening to a nurse say, "I'm so sorry," in the quiet, practiced way that people say it when they've said it 1,000 times before. I was 31 years old. I had given up my apartment in Chicago, my job at a marketing firm, and 3 years of my life to move back to Claremont, California, to take care of her. 3 years of driving her to chemo appointments, of learning how to cook low-sodium meals she could actually eat, of sitting with her on the back porch of that enormous house every evening while she told me stories about my grandfather, who had died before I was born. 3 years of my cousins calling maybe once a month, of my aunt sending flower arrangements to the house like that was the same thing as showing up. My grandmother's name was Loretta, and she was without question the best person I have ever known. Her estate was worth approximately $87 million. I did not know that until the morning of the will reading. I want to be honest about that because I know how this sounds. I know people will assume I moved in with her because I knew what was coming. But I didn't. When I left Chicago, I left because my mother called me crying and said, "Grandma can't do this alone anymore. And I live too far away and you're the only one who isn't married with kids." That was the actual conversation. I negotiated a remote consulting arrangement that paid me about 40% of what I'd been making, and I drove 14 hours to Claremont with my cat and 2 suitcases and a vague plan to figure it out. My grandmother paid me nothing. I didn't ask her to. We never talked about money, not once, in 3 years. The morning of the will reading, my aunt, my grandmother's daughter, my mother's older sister, arrived at the house wearing a black blazer and reading glasses she didn't need. She hugged me at the door in that particular way she has, both arms around you but somehow also pushing you slightly backward. Her name is Cecile. She has always reminded me of a bird of prey wearing pearls. Her husband, my uncle by marriage, came in behind her and immediately started walking through the rooms like he was appraising them. His name is Stuart. He sells commercial real estate in Scottsdale and has strong opinions about square footage. My cousin Adrienne arrived 20 minutes late, which is early for her. She's the same age as me, Cecile's daughter, and we grew up spending holidays together in this house. We used to be close, actually. When we were 12, we stayed up until 3 in the morning, making up ghost stories about the old carriage house in the backyard. I don't know exactly when that version of us stopped existing, but it was somewhere in the years when she started spending winters in Aspen, and I started spending mine driving my grandmother to radiologist appointments. My grandmother's attorney, a man named Philip, read the will in the front sitting room. It took about 40 minutes. When it was over, the room was very quiet. My grandmother had left the house, the investment accounts, the family trust, and the majority of the estate to me. She had left Cecile and Stuart a sum of $200,000 and a collection of vintage jewelry. She had left Adrienne a similar amount and a letter. Philip folded his papers and looked at the room over the top of his reading glasses and said, "Are there any questions?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Cecile stood up. What followed was not a question. I won't repeat everything she said. Some of it I've blocked it out anyway, the way your brain does with genuinely unpleasant things. But the core of it was this. I had manipulated a dying woman. I had isolated her from her real family. I had positioned myself to inherit everything through calculated emotional manipulation, and they were not going to let this stand. Stuart nodded the entire time she talked, like a bobblehead doll in a blazer. Adrienne didn't say anything. She was looking at her hands. I sat in my chair and I did not say a word. I had learned something in 3 years of caregiving, which is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not react. My grandmother used to say, "Still water runs deep, Nora. My name is Nora." She said it to me a lot. After Cecile finished, Philip reminded her that the will had been drafted 18 months prior, that my grandmother had been of completely sound mind at the time of signing, that it had been reviewed and signed with 2 independent witnesses, and that she was welcome to pursue legal remedies if she believed she had grounds. Cecile looked at him like he was something she had stepped in. They left within the hour. I sat alone in the sitting room for a long time after that, just looking at my grandmother's Persian rug and the framed photos on the mantel and the specific slant of afternoon light through the lace curtains that I had washed and rehung myself 2 Septembers ago. I wasn't happy. I wasn't triumphant. I was mostly just tired and I missed her so much it felt like a physical weight sitting on my chest. I should have known it wasn't over. That was naive of me. The calls started that same week. First from Cecile, then from Stuart, then from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be a family friend of theirs who apparently thought he could talk some sense into me. The voicemails piled up. I listened to all of them because I thought it was important to know exactly what was being said about me. Cecile's voicemails started polite and became progressively less so. By the fourth one, she was using the phrase undue influence quite a lot, which is a legal term, and I noticed that and wrote it down. The letter came 3 weeks after the will reading. It was from an attorney's office in Phoenix, not Philip, a different firm. It informed me that Cecile and Stuart were filing a lawsuit to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. It was 12 pages long and it described me, across those 12 pages, as a calculating opportunist who had deliberately severed my grandmother from her family in order to manipulate her into changing a prior will. I read it twice. Then I called my own attorney. Her name is Valerie, and she is the kind of attorney who sounds bored and slightly disappointed at all times, which I find very reassuring in a legal professional. This is not unusual, Valerie told me. Adult children contesting wills when they feel they were treated unfairly is extremely common. The legal standard for undue influence is actually quite high. You'll need documentation of your relationship with your grandmother and of her decision-making capacity over time. I have 3 years of doctor's appointments, I said. I drove her to every single one. Good, Valerie said. That's good. Keep everything. What Valerie did not mention, and what I discovered about 6 weeks into the lawsuit, was how expensive and emotionally exhausting it is to be accused of something in a legal proceeding, even when you are completely innocent. Every week brought new documents, new demands, new requests. They subpoenaed my bank records. They subpoenaed my emails. They brought in a forensic accountant to review my grandmother's financial records for the 3 years I lived with her, looking for evidence that I had been siphoning money. There was nothing to find because there was nothing there, but that didn't make it feel any less like being turned inside out. Adrian texted me once during that period. It said, "I want you to know I didn't want this to happen." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I put my phone down and went to make coffee. The thing about being accused of something you didn't do is that it makes you furious in a very particular way. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger, but the slow-burning kind that settles into your bones and makes you want to build something airtight and unassailable. I started organizing. I started documenting everything I could remember. I wrote down every conversation I'd had with my grandmother about her wishes. I dug through the boxes in the study, and I found things I hadn't even known were there. The first thing I found was a folder of letters, handwritten, dated across the last 18 months of her life, that my grandmother had written but apparently never sent. They were addressed to me. They were about why she was making the choices she was making, about what she had observed over the 30-plus years of being Cecile's mother, about what she had felt watching me show up every single day when no one else did. About the prior will, which she had changed not because I pressured her but because she had picked up the phone one afternoon to call Cecile, and Cecile had been at a charity luncheon and hadn't called her back for 4 days. 4 days. I sat on the floor of my grandmother's study for 2 hours reading those letters, and by the end I was crying, and it wasn't sad crying exactly. It was the kind where you feel seen by someone who is no longer there to tell. The second thing I found was harder. In a locked drawer in her desk, using a key I found in a ceramic dish on the windowsill that I'd always assumed was decorative, I found a USB drive. I didn't think much of it at first. My grandmother had become surprisingly tech-capable in her final years. She video-called me from an iPad when I was at the grocery store to ask about ripeness of avocados. A USB drive wasn't strange. I plugged it into my laptop. There were 17 video files on it. My grandmother sitting in her chair in the study, the same chair I had vacuumed around dozens of times, looking directly at the camera, clear-eyed and composed, and talking. She had dated each recording. The earliest was from 2 years and 3 months before her death. The last was from 11 days before she went into the hospital for the final time. In the videos she stated her name, the date, and that she was of sound mind. She talked about her estate and her intentions. She talked about Cecile, in the careful, sorrowful way that mothers talk about children they love and have also accepted. She talked about me. She said my name and she said what she saw in me, and I had to pause the video 3 times because I couldn't see the screen. She had done this herself. No one had asked her to. She had researched it. I found out later she had called Philip and asked what kind of evidence would be most useful if her wishes were ever challenged. And he had told her, and she had quietly built herself a case. My grandmother, who I thought I had been protecting, had also been protecting me. I called Valerie the same afternoon. "Are you sitting down?" I said. She said she was always sitting down. My grandmother recorded herself, I said. 17 times, over 2 years. Video, dated, stated capacity, stated intent, all of it. There was a pause that, for Valerie, constituted excitement. "Send me everything," she said. The way the legal process works, which I did not know before I lived through it, is that discovery goes both ways. When Cecile's attorneys had been demanding my bank records and emails, Valerie had been quietly building the other direction, documenting my grandmother's medical records, showing consistent cognitive capacity, gathering statements from her doctors, her neighbors, the woman at the dry cleaner she'd gone to for 20 years, the pastor at her church. Every person whose name I could give Valerie, she reached. What they said, uniformly, was that Loretta was sharp and warm and knew exactly what she wanted, and wasn't shy about saying so. When we introduced the video recordings into evidence, Cecile's attorneys asked for a continuance. They got one. And then, about 3 weeks after that continuance, they asked for another. I asked Valerie what that meant. "It means," she said in her flattest voice, "that they're beginning to understand what they're actually up against." The deposition was the worst day. I want to say that clearly. I had been through a lot by that point. The financial audit, the affidavits, the phone calls at odd hours from extended family members. I barely knew who had somehow become convinced I was a villain, but the deposition was the days I sat across a table from Cecile's attorney for 4 hours while he asked me questions designed to make 3 years of my life sound like a calculated scheme. He asked me why I had moved in. He asked me who paid for groceries. He asked me why I hadn't encouraged my grandmother to maintain her social connections, a phrase I still find breathtaking in its audacity. From the side that hadn't visited in 18 months, I answered every question. I told the truth, which is what I had, and I stuck to it. My aunt sat across the room during the deposition. We made eye contact once. I looked at her for a moment, and then I looked back at the attorney and answered his question. That night I sat in my grandmother's kitchen. My kitchen now, technically, though it still didn't feel like it, and I ate cereal for dinner, and I thought about what my grandmother used to say about Cecile. She never said it with bitterness. She said it with a kind of old exhaustion, the way you talk about a wound that healed wrong. Cecil always believed that wanting something hard enough entitled her to it, she told me once. I love her very much, but I stopped being surprised by her a long time ago. I thought about that a lot in the months after. The lawsuit took 14 months from filing to resolution. I want you to understand what that means. 14 months of legal fees, of anxiety, of waking up at 3 in the morning with my heart going too fast, of explaining to every person who asked how I was doing that I was fine, just dealing with some family stuff. 14 months of living in a house that felt simultaneously like home and like contested territory. My own legal fees by the end were just over $200,000. The week before the trial was scheduled to begin, I got a call from Valerie. "They want to settle," she said. I was standing in the backyard near the carriage house. There's a lemon tree back there that my grandmother planted 30 years ago. It was full of fruit. "What are the terms?" I asked. Valerie told me. They were asking for a portion of the liquid assets, not the house, not the bulk of the estate, but enough that the number was not small. In exchange, they would drop all claims and sign a release. "What do you think?" I asked her. "I think we'd win at trial," Valerie said. "I also think trials are unpredictable and expensive and emotionally exhausting, and you've already been through 14 months of this." I stood there for a moment, looking at the lemon tree. "No," I said. Valerie paused. "No to settling? My grandmother didn't spend 2 years recording herself, so I could hand her estate over to the people she was trying to protect it from," I said. "We go to trial." I heard something in Valerie's voice that might have been the closest she ever gets to warm. "Okay," she said. "Then we go to trial." We never actually made it to the courtroom. 2 days before the trial date, Cecile's attorney filed a motion to dismiss, meaning they were withdrawing the lawsuit entirely. No settlement, no payment, no negotiation. They simply stopped. I found out later, through Valerie, through channels that were professional and completely appropriate, that what had happened was this. One of my grandmother's doctors had agreed to testify, and what he was prepared to testify to, in detail, with 18 months of records behind him, was not only that my grandmother had been of sound mind, but that she had specifically discussed with him her concerns about her daughter's potential response to the will. That she had documented those concerns in her medical chart. That she had, in his word, demonstrated remarkable clarity about her family situation and her own wishes throughout their entire clinical relationship. Cecile's attorneys had received that deposition summary. They had withdrawn the lawsuit within 48 hours. The day the dismissal was filed, I sat in the study for a long time. The afternoon light came through the lace curtains the same way it always did. The Persian rug was the same. The photos on this mantel were the same. My grandmother as a young woman, my grandfather in his army uniform, a picture of me at maybe 8 years old sitting on this house's front steps eating a popsicle. I looked at that last photo for a while. I remembered that day. It was summer. My grandmother had made lemonade from the backyard tree and then decided it needed to be popsicles, so she poured it into an ice cube tray with toothpicks, and we waited 3 hours and then ate them on the steps, and she told me they were the best popsicles she'd ever had, which was obviously not true, but she said it like she meant it. I hadn't thought about that in years. I got a text from Adrian that evening. It said, "Mom is furious. I'm sorry this happened. I want you to know I never filed anything and I never intended to. I thought about not responding. I thought about it for a long time. Then I wrote back, I know. I'm not angry at you." That was true. I had a lot of feelings about Adrian, but anger wasn't really the right word for any of them. Grief, maybe. A specific kind of sadness for the cousins we used to be. She wrote back, "Can we get coffee sometime?" I said, "Maybe, give me some time. I haven't reached out yet. I'm still giving myself that time. What I will tell you is this. My grandmother knew what she was doing. She knew exactly, completely, in full detail what she was doing. She had thought it through more carefully than any of us gave her credit for. She recorded herself not because she was afraid of dying, but because she loved me enough to protect me after she was gone, and she was smart enough to understand exactly what that protection needed to look like. The house is mine now, fully, legally, undisputedly mine. I repainted the kitchen last month, a pale yellow that my grandmother had picked out 2 summers ago and never gotten around to. I found the paint chip tucked into a cookbook, which is where she kept things like that. Small squares of color with names like Buttermilk and Sunwashed in a little stack inside a Julia Child collection. I used the one called Morning Honey. It's almost exactly what she picked. Close enough. The lemon tree is blooming again. This morning I made lemonade, and I stood on the back porch drinking it, and I thought about how she used to do the same thing. In the same spot, in the years before I knew her house would one day be the thing I was asked to fight for. I would have fought a lot longer. I want to be clear about that. She raised me to understand that the right thing and the easy thing are usually not the same thing, and that the only way to know which one you're doing is to ask yourself if you could look the person you most admired in the eye and say, honestly, that you made the right call. I can.